welcome to our second video in our three-part series on the neuron. In this video, we're going to focus on what we call the action potential, the change in charge that runs down the length of the neuron's axon and allows it to release information to other neurons in a network. Okay, so here we have the neuron, and we spoke about the specific structural components of the neuron in our first video. So if you haven't watched that one yet, you might want to go back and check that out before starting this one. When a neuron is not passing on any information to other neurons, we say that that neuron is in its resting state. And when a neuron is in its resting state, we know a couple of things about that neuron. One of the things we know is the membrane of that neuron has what we would call a negative net charge. And a negative net charge just means that inside of the neuron is more negatively charged than outside of the neuron. So here we're zoomed in on a little section of the axon. And outside of the axon, we have a large number of positively charged ions. Now, an ion is just a charged atom. So what we have here is a larger concentration of positively charged ions outside of the neuron, and here inside the neuron's axon we have more negatively charged ions. So we say there's a negative net charge, and all this means is that the inside of the neuron compared to the outside of the neuron is more negatively charged. Now again, when in this resting state, when the neuron has a negative net charge in comparison to outside of the neuron, this neuron is not sending on any information. It's not firing this action potential. This doesn't mean that the neuron is not receiving information from other neurons. So remember, we have the dendrites of the neuron, which are essentially the ears of the cell, and at any time there might be any number of other neurons communicating and sending information into this neuron, even though it's not necessarily passing any information on. Now, these messages that the dendrites are receiving may do one of two things. They might excite this neuron, and all we mean when we say excite is increase the positive charge of the neuron. Or these messages being received by the dendrites may inhibit the neuron, and all this means is that they're lowering the charge of this neuron. So depending on the type of messages this neuron is receiving from other neurons, whether they be excitatory or inhibitory, is going to change the charge of this neuron during its resting state. When this neuron receives enough excitatory information from other neurons, it reaches something that we call the firing threshold, or the threshold of excitation. And all this is a specific amount of positive charge required to begin this process of an action potential. So let's look at how this action potential would work. As information comes in from other neurons that is of an excitatory nature, so increasing the charge of this neuron, the positive charge of this neuron relative to outside is going to rise to a specific level. And once it reaches that threshold of excitation, really exciting things start to happen. One of the main things that happens here is that little tiny doors on the outside of the axon begin to open up. So these are called ion channels. So once the threshold of excitation is reached, once this neuron reaches a specific required positive charge, these channels open up. And guess what happens when the ion channels open up? Well, sure enough, these positive ions that have been outside of the cell all start jumping inside of the cell. So the positive ions that were hanging out and clustered and concentrated outside of this neuron start popping inside the neuron once these ion channels have opened up. And what this does is it increases the charge of this strip of the axon. So we start getting a lot more positive charge inside the axon. And this is something that we call depolarization. So as the positive ions move into this section of the axon. It increases the positive charge, and this increase of positive charge in this section of the axon causes more ion channels to open up further down the length of the axon. So as a result of this increase of positive charge over here on the left, the ion channels further down the axon start to open up, and just as before, these positive ions get move through these ion channels into the cell. And this continues all the way down the length of the axon. So what we would say is that this change in net charge, or this action potential, propagates down the length of the axon. To recap, this neuron, while in its resting state, will be receiving information from other neurons by way of its dendrites. And some of this information is going to be excitatory, some of it may be inhibitory, but certainly once enough excitatory information is received by this dendrite, the positive charge is going to increase, and once it does, ion channels are going to start opening up in the axon, and once ion channels start opening up at the base here, positive ions are going to move into the axon, further increasing its charge to be more positive, and as this happens, the ion channels next door open up, more positive ions rush on in, and this will happen and run all the way down the length of the axon. This is what we call an action potential. Ion channels opening up, positively charged ions rushing into the neuron, increasing the positive charge so that there's no longer this negative net charge in comparison to the outside, and the increase of positive charge at one area of the axon is going to cause the ion channels next door to open up, and this positive charge continues all the way down. This action potential runs all the way down the length of the axon until it reaches the end, and it reaches what we call the axon terminals. Now these are just the little nubs here, the little ends of the axon, and in each of these axon terminals we have little storage containers that are called vesicles. And inside of these vesicles are stored neurotransmitters. Now we'll talk more about neurotransmitters in our third upcoming video, but this is essentially the message that gets sent on from this neuron to the other neurons. And these neurotransmitters on their own have the potential to be excitatory or inhibitory. So once this action potential runs all the way down the length of the axon, reaches the axon terminals, these vesicles open up. And once they open up, the neurotransmitters are released out and then go on to communicate with the dendrites of other neurons. You might be asking yourself, what happens once the axon has become positively charged? Does it continue to stay positively charged? Does the neuron continue to be depolarized so that the inside of the neuron is positively charged and so is the outside of the neuron? And no, this is not the case. Once that positive charge runs down the length of that section of axon, these ion channels close, and things called ion pumps take the positive ions that are now inside the neuron and kick them out. As the ion pumps pump the positively charged ions that are now inside the neuron, they pump them outside of the neuron, that neuron starts returning back to that negative net charge. So it becomes more negatively charged compared to the outside, and becomes more similar to how it was before that action potential was fired. So we return to a negative net charge. As these positive ions are pumped out of the neuron, the charge of the neuron becomes more negative in comparison to the outside of the neuron. But it actually goes one step further than this, and in fact the neuron, as these positive ions are being pumped out, reaches another state that we call the refractory period. And during the refractory period, this neuron is actually what we would call hyperpolarized. It becomes more negatively charged than it was during its resting state. And during this refractory period, the neuron cannot actually fire another action potential. It's so negatively charged that even if it's receiving a ton of excitatory information from other neurons, it will never increase that positive charge to reach that threshold of excitation again while it's in this refractory period. After an action potential is fired, the neuron takes a few milliseconds during this refractory period where it is so negatively charged, when it is so hyperpolarized that it can't fire another action potential. Eventually, however, after 2-3 milliseconds, that positive charge starts to creep back in and the neuron will return to what we called the resting state, where it is still negatively charged, still has a negative net charge in comparison to the outside, but now all it needs is more excitatory information coming from other neurons to bring it back up to that threshold of excitation, or that firing threshold. And then another action potential will be fired. We can use this diagram to describe the time course as a neuron moves from its resting state to firing of an action potential down to its refractory period and then back to its resting state. So on the y-axis here, we have the positive charge of the neuron, and on the x-axis, we have time. So the farther right we move, the more time has passed. So when a neuron is in its resting state, it has a negative net charge. It is less positively charged than the outside of the cell. As it receives excitatory messages from other neurons, however, the positive charge inside the neuron will increase until it reaches this threshold of excitation, this specific amount of positive charge that once reached will fire the action potential. And the ion channels at the base of the axon will open up, positively charged ions will rush into the cell, increasing the positive charge of that neuron. Once the action potential has made its way through the axon, however, the ion channels close, the ion pumps move all of those positively charged ions from inside of the cell back out of the cell, and the charge of the neuron decreases again. And in fact, it decreases so much that we actually dip lower than the original negative net charge during its resting state. So during this phase, which we call the refractory period, we'd say the neuron is hyperpolarized. The inside of the cell is really negatively charged compared to outside of the cell. It would be impossible for the neuron to fire an action potential while so negatively charged during this refractory period. Over time, however, the positive charge will creep back up to where it was at the very beginning. And this neuron has re-entered its resting state. Okay, and that's our video on the action potential. If you'd like to learn more about what happens when that action potential reaches the axon terminals and releases neurotransmitters from the vesicles, be sure to check out our third video, where we will discuss the synapse. If you learned something from the video and you'd like to see more like it, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions about anything we covered today, or if you have any ideas for other concepts you'd like us to cover in future videos, please leave us a comment.